Hi, I'm Susie Jones, and I'm a news reporter here in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis at a radio station. And I am so excited to be part of this year's event. I came to learn about ataxia probably 10 years or so ago when my daughter was in high school and had a friend whose father has ataxia, Joe Sweeney, and the Sweeney family. A lot of people know that name. So it's really a pleasure to be part of this event. We all know that living with ataxia is in fact a journey, and whether you're pursuing a diagnosis or you already have one, the things that you do to even manage your health really do matter. And as with many rare diseases, the best practices treatments change over the years and there's more options available. So I'm very excited today to have with us Dr. VIkram Shakkottai and Dr. Lauren Moore to learn more about the National Ataxia Foundation and what it's doing to accelerate treatment developments and where we are in the fight for a cure. Welcome, VIkram. Can you tell us, first of all, a little bit about yourself and maybe your expertise and your role at NAF?
Thank you so much, Susie. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I am a neurologist, and I direct the Ataxia Clinic here at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. And I was at the University of Michigan before, where I've had an experience of seeing patients with ataxia in a dedicated clinic for over a decade now. Today I'm here as the chair of the Medical Research Advisory Board of the National Ataxia Foundation. I've been associated with the NAF's MRAB, the Medical Research Advisory Board, for close to a decade, but as a chair for the last several years. And I have also had the distinct privilege and pleasure of being a NAF-funded researcher as well. So I'm speaking in part with all those individual roles through the NAF.
Can you tell us a little bit a part of that funding? I know that the National Ataxia Foundation's annual budget is spent on their ataxia research funding grant program. So can you talk about that funding program and why it's important to the ataxia community?
Absolutely. I think this is a really important initiative of the National Ataxia Foundation. And I'm just going to outline some of the awards, the research awards that the NAF gives to researchers in this area. I want to highlight one of them, which is a relatively new research opportunity through the NAF, which is to increase the diversity of the scientists studying ataxia through a pre-doctoral award. So these are individuals who are doing their graduate training and research in ataxia. But I'm going to highlight the award schemes that the MRAB submitted or reviewed and forwarded to the NAF for funding. And these are the others that you can see below the top category that you see up there. And these are the postdoctoral fellowship awards, the Young Investigators Award, the Research Seed Money Grants, and the Pioneer SCA3 MJD Translational Research Awards. I want to highlight that the NAF, and through the work of the Medical Research Advisory Board and a lot of reviewers, grant who work in this ataxia field, really strive to support research that will move understanding of disease mechanisms and really make treatment possible for all kinds of ataxias. And in the grants scheme, I think I'm going to highlight some of the individual awards, because I think that's something that we're very grateful for donors to support this really important initiative of the NAF.
And VIkram, can you tell us about this year's selection?
Yep, absolutely. So there were a number of awards that were submitted for funding to the NAF this year. But I'm going to highlight several of them, I think, which show the scope and the range of the kinds of research that are consistent with the NAF's grant funding goal of moving therapies forward in ataxia. So I'm going to highlight 4 of these awards from each of those 4 types of grants that I showed you. From the pilot award scheme, I'm going to highlight a proposal from Dr. Matthew Scaglione at Duke University, which was a research seed money grant. These are grants that are allow for an initial evaluation of an area that potentially will then be generally by a more seasoned investigator, so that this can be used for greater funding through the NIH or other funding agencies. And I want to highlight Dr. Scaglione's work, who has been already successful in obtaining larger, what we call extramural funding through the NAF, through the NIH, sorry, through these research seed money grants. The second that I'm going to highlight is from Xiaojing Sui. Dr. Sui is a postdoctoral researcher at Northwestern University. And this grant, I think, highlights using model systems, in this case, a worm model, to really understand novel interactions of proteins that are abnormal in ataxias to try and identify new drug targets in an unbiased way. And that's really important. The third grant proposal that I'm going to highlight is from Dr. Patricia Maciel at the University of Minot, which is a Pioneer Award. So these are proposals that really move translational, meaning treatments potentially forward in the near-term future. So this is using a TUDCA, which is a bile salt, which has been used in other degenerative diseases and shows promise in other degenerative diseases as a novel therapeutic agent, and the relevance of this specifically in spinocerebellar ataxia type 3, the most common dominantly inherited spinocerebellar ataxia. The fourth grant that I'm going to highlight is digital devices to assess balance and gait in the spinocerebellar ataxias by Dr. Ratan Kumar Shah from OHSU. And this is a Young Investigators Award. And this is an award that really looks to prepare patients for clinical trial readiness using gait biomarkers to know whether any treatment is actually going to impact something that's relevant to walking or something functional in patients. So I think these four grants that I highlight show the diversity of grants, but also are consistent with NAF's aim of moving therapies forward, identifying novel therapeutic agents, as well as understanding basic mechanisms in the ataxias.
Dr. Shakkottai, we want to thank you for that very interesting update. Appreciate that. Let's talk to Dr. Lauren Moore now, NAF's new Chief Scientific Officer with close ties already to the ataxia community. She's a researcher and she has a family member with ataxia. So how did you get involved in the community?
Hi, Susie. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I've been in the ataxia community about a decade now, and I first heard of the word ataxia when my dad became diagnosed with SCA3 and started showing symptoms for this disease. At the time, this was really devastating news for me. I started doing research on the disease, and at the time, there was no available therapies to slow or stop this disorder.
So once you get this diagnosis, what did you decide to do? I know you were going into grad school, so sort of how did this change your trajectory?
Yep. So because there were no diseases, I felt like I had to do something about it myself. So I ended up going to grad school and working with Dr. Hank Paulson at the University of Michigan, who is an expert in SCA3, and I did my PhD in his lab.
That's fantastic. Was it hard, though, to be both a researcher, sort of learning about some of this tough stuff and all the work that's yet to be done, and having that family member, having your dad with ataxia? Was it sort of tough to get through?
Yeah, it certainly was something that I was very concerned about, and especially my parents were very concerned about how I would feel living and breathing in this ataxia field every day with my dad also having symptoms progressing at the time as well. But thankfully, that was not the case. I'm so glad that I ended up going into ataxia research, because I quickly found that there was so much research being done, and we were getting closer and closer to therapies that showed a lot of promise for these diseases. In fact, a lot of my graduate work was working on testing gene silencing therapies for SCA3. And the next generation of the therapies that I was working on in grad school are going into phase 1 clinical trials later this year, which really shows how quickly these therapies are progressing into clinical trials for ataxias.
That is incredible. That's great news. So when will these drugs actually become available for patients, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there are some clinical trials going on right now. And like I mentioned, there's quite a few more that will be starting later this year and in the coming years. I think that as a patient community, though, we can do a lot to help support these clinical trials and help push us closer to many more clinical trials and getting even more drug companies interested in these diseases.
So how can people listening, how can patients and family members, how can everybody get involved to sort of help with this process moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the biggest obstacles is that we still don't understand these diseases as well as we'd like, and we haven't developed really good ways of tracking the progression of symptoms in individuals over time. So one of the ways that individuals can help prepare us for clinical trials is to get involved in natural history studies. I've highlighted ReadySCA here, but there's a number of other natural history studies going on in the ataxias, such as the CRCSCA natural history study that NAF is helping to support. So what these studies do is they're aimed at both using tools that we have already, such as the SARA score that anyone with ataxia is likely very aware of, to track the disease over time, but also testing new ways to track the disease through new clinical tests, or looking in blood or cerebral spinal fluid to see if we can find things that we can measure to track these diseases in a much easier and quantitative way. So that when we have a clinical trial and therapy is given, we can tell in a very short amount of time whether the drug is improving patient symptoms.
And talk a little bit more about the pharmaceutical industry and its interest in doing work on ataxia and medications and drugs. Is there something that people in the ataxia community can actually do to help further that cause?
Mm-hmm. So one of the most exciting things for me since joining NAF early this year is just understanding how many drug companies are coming to us at the National Ataxia Foundation and saying, we want to develop drugs in the ataxia field. Is the ataxia patient population ready? Do we know where those patients are? Do they know what a clinical trial is? And are they ready to participate in this trial? So what we as patients and family members of persons with ataxia is to do everything we can to make it clear to these drug companies that we are ready and we are here and we do know what it takes to participate in clinical trials. So one of the things that National Ataxia Foundation is doing to help get individuals prepared for these clinical trials is starting a series of webinars called the Prep Rare. There was one, actually, the first one was in February, and I gave that talk. So hopefully a number of you joined in on that talk, and they will be available for people to watch after they're recorded, so you don't have to watch them live. But the whole point of these webinars is to give information to help patients be ready and aware of what they need to do to participate in these clinical trials. Another very important step is to register on the CORDS registry. So this is where drug companies will actually go to see how many patients there are available. And it's also how they will contact persons with ataxia to see if they want to participate in their clinical trials. So it's very important to register. And in addition to register, it's also really important to know which genetic ataxia you have and to have a genetic confirmation if you want to participate in clinical trials. Almost every clinical trial will require a genetic test. And I know that this is a very personal decision that many individuals in the past have not wanted to undergo for fear that it might affect things like insurance, or just for the simple fact that there were no drugs available. So what's the point in getting genetic testing? That is no longer the case. There are so many clinical trials that will be happening in the next 5 to 10 years that it's important now that we actually do get genetic testing so that we can't identify ourselves and let drug companies know that we're here and ready for clinical trials.
Looking at the screen a bit more, one of the issues as well, or opportunities for patients, it's a little bit, as you said, personal, but that the brain donation piece, can you talk about what that means and how that helps actually in the progress of what you're doing?
Yeah, if an individual is interested in donating their brain to ataxia research, NAF has tried to make this as easy as possible by developing a pre-plan that people can submit. And this really helps both the individual and the family so that if when the time comes that it's as easy and seamless as possible to donate to the National Ataxia Foundation. And as a previous I used to be highly involved in ataxia research myself in the lab, and I actually have used patient samples to help advance research. And I know firsthand how important those resources are to understanding these diseases.
Because you can really see it in the brain then, Dr. Moore, when you're dissecting it, just exactly what's going on with ataxia that's different from other people.
Yep, exactly. I also wanted to highlight another program that the National Ataxia Foundation launched this year, which is a free genetic counseling and testing initiative. So I mentioned how important it is to get genetic testing, and NAF wants to help overcome some obstacles that individuals may have faced in the past that prevented them from getting genetic testing, such as the cost of the actual tests themselves. So we've started this initiative in SCA 3 only, but we hope to expand to SCA 1, 2, and 3 later this year. And that's entirely free to the individuals who want to participate.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Moore. Is there anything you want to add before we open this up to questions from the audience?
Just that it's a really exciting time to be in the ataxia community. And I think that there's reason to have a lot of hope for the future going forward.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moore, and thanks to Dr. Shakkottai for speaking as well. And as we said, we're just going to now turn it over to the live audience and let them ask their questions of you. And so again, time for us to go live and take your questions. Live right now with you at the conference, taking your questions from the audience. A reminder that if you are looking at your screen, there is a page for you on the navigation to ask your questions right there. And we'll get started right away with our questions. We'll ask Dr. Shakkottai, are there any clinical trials going on for the ataxias as we speak right now?
I'm very excited to say that there are already several phase 3 studies, as you have already been introduced to the clinical trial process by Dr. Lauren Moore. The phase 3 is to show efficacy for treatment of ataxia, and Biohaven Pharmaceuticals is doing a trial with an agent intended to improve symptoms. And there is another study specifically targeted for SCA3 from Selos Pharmaceuticals. What I'm also really excited about sharing with you is that there are several early stage, these are phase 1 studies by companies that are targeting the specific gene in the inherited ataxias by Biogen and VIkram Pharmaceuticals. And I also want to now, I'm also excited about a new development in the NAF, which is hiring Dr. Moore to be the first chief scientific officer of the NAF, and to play a greater role in engaging NAF and its members in these really important clinical trials. Over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, Lauren, I wanted to ask you, one participant is asking, how can I learn more about clinical trials? Can you address that?
Yeah, so I would encourage folks to check out the first talk that I gave as part of our Prep series. The topic of the talk is titled Intro to the NAF's new CSO, but the real focus of the talk is how to find a clinical trial that's relevant to you and how to prepare your clinical trial resume so that you are ready for clinical trials and are able to actively engage and find ones that are eligible to you. So please check out that talk that's uploaded on the NAF website. You can find any clinical trials on clinicaltrial.gov. And I'll also just say that in the coming months, there will be a lot more resources added to the NAF website where we're going to track a lot of these drugs that are in development in real time. So please stay tuned for those as well.
And Lauren, might I add, can you tell us a little bit more about the free genetic counseling, the testing initiative? Who's eligible? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're still in the feasibility stage of that study, in which we're only enrolling a small group, about 50 to 60 SCA3 patients. But so far that has gone really well, and we're getting positive feedback from that. So we plan to open up to phase 2 all SCA3 at-risk individuals, as well as SCA1 and 2 in the very near future. So stay tuned for those, and announcements for those will be coming out through email. And there's also a genetic testing interest form that you can find on the NAF website.
And again, you sort of alluded to it there, but where can members go to find out more about information on the research that NAF has funded? Lauren.
Yes, so VIkram highlighted some of the grants that were given out this year, but within the next couple of weeks, we'll be uploading details of every grant that we've given out this year, as well as you can look back at the previous years of grant funding that we've given out for all these different researchers.
Great, and I want to remind people that are watching right now that on your screen there is a navigation tool that allows you to ask a question of VIkram or Lauren, and we have time for questions. So if you ask a question, it will come to me and then I will relay it on to them. I have a question here for VIkram. What is a SARA score, number one, and why is it important to see an ataxia specialist or neurologist? VIkram?
Those are great questions. So the SARA score, it's an acronym for the Scale for the Assessment and Rating of Ataxia. It's a clinical score that's semi-quantitative so that you can follow the progress of an individual who has motor problems from the ataxia over time to see how that changes. And we think that this kind of score, such as the SARA, is very important for clinical trials. So how does one know if an intervention potentially changes the course of disease unless you can measure it in some way that is reliable across investigators, across multiple sites? And I think that that's the importance of scales such as the SARA or the SARA score. And I guess the second question was, sorry, Susie, if you could ask me the second part of that question again.
The second part of your question was, you explained the score. Why is it important to see a neurologist or an ataxia specialist as opposed to, I suppose, any other doctor? Maybe
yeah, so no, that's a really important, great question. And I'm going to break it down into, I think, several things. The first is getting an answer for what the cause of the ataxia is. I think there's a general lack of experience by most community neurologists as to what ataxia is and what causes it. And I think it's important to recognize that there are currently forms of ataxia that can be treated, particularly when detected early. And these include some of the immune-mediated ataxias. I think that's the first part of that answer. And the second is, even if there's an ataxia that runs in a family, to define it, to know what it means for you, what it means for your future, what it means for your children and potentially your grandchildren, I think recognizing what that cause of ataxia is really important. And the third is, Lauren's already mentioned this, there's a lot of active interest in treatment for ataxia, and particularly in the specific genes that cause ataxia, and recognition of what that is important for participation in clinical trials. And clinical studies and clinical trials are often through neurologists who have a lot of expertise and experience in seeing patients with ataxia. And in order to really be informed about what these trials involve and what it means for you, I think it's really important to see an ataxia specialist.
VIkram, is there any prevention or preventative measures that can be taken? So for example, if you have a family member with it and you don't know for sure if they have it, can you do anything ahead of time to prevent the onset of it?
At this point, we don't have any strong clinical evidence for disease-modifying treatments. But this is an area of really active research, including gene suppression studies, including the phase 1 studies that I mentioned to you earlier, which is not to say that there are not general measures to maintain one's health, even if you know that there is a risk of developing ataxia in the family, including staying physically and mentally active and having a lifestyle that, that maximizes your training in balance, for example.
All right, we have a question next for Lauren. Lauren, how do you register for CORDS? Kind of explain what it is, and how do you register? You mentioned the natural history study. How do you sign up for that as well?
So there's links to the CORDS registry, both at the NAF website, and I also believe in the actual conference sorry, the platform that we're working on right now. But if you just go to CORDS registry, if you just type it into your search bar, it'll come up quickly, and very easily you'll find a link to join CORDS. And that is critically important as a way for us to both have a better idea of how many ataxia patients there are, which is an important measure when drug companies are considering whether they want to go into drug development for a certain type of ataxia. We want the number that these pharmaceutical companies are seeing to be more representative of what it actually is in this country. So that's one of the very important purposes of CORDS. You also is a way for recruiters to directly reach out to you to see if you might be interested in participating in a clinical study. If you're interested in participating in a natural history study, you can either go through clinicaltrials.gov and look up for the different clinical trials in ataxia, or you can talk to your neurologist or ataxia specialist directly. There are also links for the CRC-SCA study specifically, which is the large natural history study being sponsored by NAF and some of our drug company sponsors. And that information is also on the NAF website. So you can just look up CRC-SCA.
Lauren, question for either you or Vikram. Is there a sense that it's an underreported condition when you say we want the drug companies to know how many people have ataxia? Is it something that there are more people out there than we know about kind of situation?
Yes, I would say unequivocally yes, that this is a very underdiagnosed disease. And even when it is underdiagnosed, it's not reported well through things like the patient registry. Those are the numbers that are publicly available to pharma companies. And so if you aren't registered on CORDS, you're basically not being counted in the tally at this time. We also know that ataxia can also be quite a long journey for diagnosis. And patients can take many years before they actually see an ataxia specialist or someone with knowledge in ataxia. So yes, I would agree that it's very diagnosed currently.
Yeah. All right. This is a question for Vikram. How to get involved and set up in clinical trial in Canada or other international locations? We'll start with that. There are a couple more. So maybe you want to address that, Vikram, right now.
So if the question is how to participate in a clinical trial in a country other than the United States, I think many pharmaceutical companies are, because of the relative rarity of identifying individuals with specific inherited forms of ataxia, have already approached the question by looking at more than one country simultaneously. And I think, again, whichever country you live in, including Canada, there are ataxia specialists. And I think what's another exciting development for the NAF is there is now a Canadian site in the natural history, CRC-SCA natural history study based out of Montreal. And I think the goal is to also make sure that participation in clinical trials and registries is worldwide.
Vikram, another question for you. It seems like SCA3 has most of the clinical trials going on right now. Can that help those of us who don't have SCA3 somehow? Is there any sort of residual help going on there with that?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to highlight that SCA3 is likely the most common dominantly inherited ataxia, which is why there is more interest in SCA3 than some of the other spinocerebellar ataxias, which is not to say that there is not interest in many of the other SCAs that will happen in the near, which is already happening in the near future. And there are two approaches to treatment of ataxia. One is specific to that gene, using gene targeting strategies. And there are others, such as what the trial that Biohaven Pharmaceuticals is doing now, which is treatment of symptoms or treatment of some shared biological feature across several ataxias. So knowledge from an SCA3 trial can potentially tell us two different things. One is how to plan for trials in relatively less common forms of SCA, but also whether there are shared mechanisms of disease that can be targeted across the different SCAs.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that real quick. It's been shown time and time again that when there is a successful clinical trial in a disease where it leads to commercialization of some kind of therapy, it leads to a lot of other pharma companies suddenly taking interest and investing in that space. So one success is very likely to lead to more success and most importantly to more funding, which can lead to even more shots on goal and more ataxias being treated. So.
Great, thank you. Reminding people that you're watching, if you have a question on the screen, there's a navigation area. You can go right there and ask a question, and that question then will be delivered to me to ask of our experts here. Lauren, where do we find the brain donation gift pre-plan form? And I'm not going to be able to read this because do you really feel truly spinal cerebellar ataxia might be able to be cured once I've experienced brain cell death? Did I say that wrong?
Sorry, I'll address the brain donation question first.
Sure.
So that is on the patient resources on the NAF page. And that really has been a very successful program. I believe we have over 150 people with pre-plans in place. So if you are interested in donating your brain tissue, it just makes it a lot easier for both you as well as your loved ones that this pre-plan is in place. And it just makes the whole process a lot smoother so that your wishes can be followed without too many issues. And I will say that I just a comment to anyone who has a family member who has donated their brain, that tissue is, it's so valuable to research and is being actively used. I get emails all the time from investigators who have used tissue from that brain bank and want to make sure that they're getting their thanks out to the patients because their work couldn't have been done without those resources. So just a thank you to those who have loved ones who have donated or who are considering brain donation. Because they really are a huge tool for researchers. Sorry, and then the second question, it's can spinocerebellar ataxia be cured? Honestly, we don't know if we have a successful treatment that can stop the disease in its tracks. We don't know how successful that will be at fixing any kind of symptoms that have already started. I think that right now our aim is stopping or slowing of disease, and one day perhaps we can have full cures. But right now, I think all of us, if we could have something that could stop the disease in its tracks right now, could be extremely beneficial to our entire community. And a number of therapies, especially the gene targeting therapies, are aimed at something like that.
Thank you, Lauren. A question for Vikram.
I will just add one thing to what Lauren said, and I think it's the importance of there are agents that are in development to treat symptoms of disease, and I think participation in those studies is equally important to gene-specific treatments because we want to be able to help individuals with ataxia at whatever stage of disease they're at.
Okay, sorry for interrupting you, Vikram. There was another question for you at this point. There are so many types of ataxia. My own personal question, how many do we know? Have we identified every kind of ataxia there is out there?
So that's a really good question. And you probably all know that every year we discover several new genes that cause ataxia. So we have not identified all the genetic causes of ataxia. And I think this is best illustrated by a relatively new form of ataxia that we recognized only 2 years ago, known as RFC1-associated canvas syndrome. It's a relatively common form of ataxia worldwide, the gene of which was only discovered 2 years ago. So there are probably over 600 different genes that can cause ataxia in some form or another. And the list does keep growing.
Well, I was going to say, Lauren, real quick, and that the question was essentially, with so many, how can you do studies on so many? Do they just hone in on one specific? And either Lauren or VIkram can address that. And then Lauren, if you wanted to follow up and respond to what VIkram just said, I'll stop talking.
So I'll let Lauren go. I'm sure she has a lot to say, but I think she already kind of mentioned understanding disease in one form of ataxia can give insight into a number of others. Because although these are separate genes, there are pathways that are potentially shared across several different forms of ataxia. And even gene-specific treatment for one disease may actually apply to several others, even if that gene is not mutated. And I think this is illustrated by conditions like ALS, motor neuron disease, or Lou Gehrig's disease, where we already know that a gene that causes a relatively rare form potentially can apply more broadly to other forms of the disease.
And then my follow-up was, with so many new causes of genetic ataxia being identified every year, if you're one of those individuals who maybe 5-10 years ago went and got genetic testing and you found that you were negative for all of the most common SCAs, and you're still looking for a diagnosis, those new forms of genetic ataxia provide hope that there really is an actual diagnosis available to you now. So if you are considering, you still are in that diagnostic journey where you don't have an answer yet, consider talking to your neurologist or ataxia specialist again about getting next generation sequencing approaches to identify new forms of ataxia that you may have.
This question is for VIkram, but I imagine both of you might want to respond, because this is really important. This is something I've learned from being a part of the ataxia family on the periphery anyway for these many years. What's being done in the medical field to get more neurologists and doctors educated about ataxia? Because so many stories of families that had to go to doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor to finally, as you said, years to get someone to diagnose them. Is there something that's being introduced in medical schools that might increase the numbers?
No, that's a really good question, and something that the NAF has recognized. And I think Lauren will speak to some of the initiatives that the NAF has taken. I will mention that for the first time at the AAC, there is a resident, a neurology movement disorders fellow training session known as the ACT that's happening tomorrow and on Saturday, or on Friday and Saturday, to educate specialists, even in the movement disorders, neurologists who have decided that they want to learn about balance and other disorders, educate them about genetics and various different forms of management of ataxia. So I think this is a really important initiative, and we recognize that this needs to happen.
Mm.
Yes, we're really excited to have those young clinicians joining us this week, and you may see a couple of them pop up in different Birds of a Feather session. We're having them attend so that they can interact directly with you folks and hopefully become more inspired and more dedicated to continuing on in their careers in ataxia research. And this is the first year we're doing this, but we're hoping that we can expand on this in future years and keep getting the next generation of Dr. Shakkottais to join our field. Also, if I wanted to make everyone aware that there's the neurologist and ataxia specialist list of clinicians that we know have experience with ataxia patients. We continue to add and vet that list. So please check that out if you're happy with your current care. And I do encourage you, even if it's difficult to see an ataxia specialist, every year, every 2 years, try to see an ataxia specialist as often as you can. Even if it's once every 5 years, it could be incredibly helpful for making sure that you're getting the best standard of care for ataxia, and you're you're being kept up to date with new therapies and new clinical trials available to you. So even if you can't go every year, if you can't go every 6 months, just try to add that to your schedule if possible.
I will just add to that. I mean, I don't know that I would, I mean, I'm sure your primary neurologists are very competent and good physicians, but nevertheless, it's, even if it's not that the care provided is meets your expectations, I think seeing an ataxia specialist, even if it's not on an ongoing frequent basis, to kind of talk to your neurologist and communicate with them as to what the advances potentially are and what other things could be modified could be very beneficial.
A question for Lauren. One of the participants writes, is the CORDS patient registry just for patients with hereditary ataxia?
No, it is not. There are many options to choose there. You can choose unknown, sporadic, rare. There's even places where you can fill in your type of ataxia. So no, it is not just for those most common ataxias.
And to VIkram, the question is, are there clinical trials for undiagnosed ataxia patients?
So there are, it has been challenging for undiagnosed ataxia patients to participate in clinical studies. And partly it's because an intervention that's targeted towards some aspect of disease, it's very hard to know, have the strong scientific rationale for those undiagnosed ataxias. But I think undiagnosed ataxias are not going to be undiagnosed forever. I think as we make advances in gene testing initiatives, such as what the NAF is taking in terms of genetic testing, I think we will have answers. So I think it's important, therefore, to seek out answers and be proactive about knowing what kind of ataxia you have.
Yep, and I'll follow up on that just to say that not only are we able to identify more ataxias, but we're also able to do it more at a much lower cost. So $5,000, $10,000 tests several years ago are now can be as low as $100 to $300, depending on what the type of ataxia is. So if that was a financial obstacle before, it may no longer be.
Great. Lauren and VIkram, thank you. We have about 3 minutes left. We do have a time for a question, but be mindful that we're running out of time. VIkram, for you, it seems that current studies only focus on the SCAs. Are there any studies, this is sort of, we talked about this, on recessive ataxia? I have a rare type. Should I just resign myself to the fact that a cure for my type will probably be found after other types? Is it that kind of pecking order situation? And remember the time, please.
No, absolutely not. So there are, I will say that there are studies of symptomatic agents for ataxia that include some of the recessive ataxias already. And there is a large initiative that's being planned for the ARCAs, the autosomal recessive cerebellar ataxias, that involves sites both in Europe as well as in North America. So I think there is a lot of interest. So this is an exciting time to be in the ataxia space for all forms of ataxia. And I think having a chief scientific officer at the NAF is both a testament and an indication of this excitement.
Very good. We have 1 minute left to the both of you. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap it up? Lauren?
I guess just that I'm so thankful that the National Ataxia Foundation exists. I'm so thankful that researchers like Dr. Shakkottai exist, and that this field is just blossoming. It's getting bigger than I could have ever imagined. I can't wait till we can all be together in person. And it's just a very hopeful time. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Very good. And VIkram, you have 30 seconds.
I just want to thank all of you members and the ataxia community for really inspiring me to pursue this area of research and care. And I just want you to keep your hopes up that we're all working hard. And I think treatments are closer than you or me think, or hopefully it's in the near horizon.
Wonderful. And thanks everyone for listening today. And thank you for being part of this event.